Thank you for making time to spend with us today as we do a webinar to discuss the post-election thoughts on what we can expect from Washington, D.C. I'm Andrew Mies, Chief Investment Officer for Six Meridian, and very pleased to welcome Jason Cole, who will be leading this discussion. I'll be helping facilitate the Q&A. Jason serves as the Executive Director and Head of Public Policy at FS Investments, where he leads the firm's public policy and government affairs efforts at the federal, state, and local levels. Jason previously worked at CBC Companies, Cornell University, MetLife, and UBS. He also served for over a decade in the U.S. House of Representatives as a legislative director and later as a chief of staff. Jason received a bachelor's degree in philosophy and political science from Kansas State University and a master's degree in public administration from Syracuse. Jason was a featured speaker at the Six Meridian Investor Summit earlier this year, so many of you will remember seeing him. And with that, Jason, I'd like to welcome you into the conversation, and I'm going to turn it over and allow you to go through all the material and let us know what we should expect.
Thanks, Andrew. It's really a pleasure to be with you all today. I remember fondly my trip to Wichita back in May. As Andrew indicated, I got my bachelor's degree from Kansas State University. I'm a native Kansan, so it's always great to talk to people from home. And I'm again thrilled to be with you today. I'm going to pull up a slideshow and go through a few slides. So when I was with all of you back in May, I showed a version of a slide that you have here where I made the point that the electorate is becoming increasingly restless, and that for the last 20 years or so, there's been a series of elections where either the House, the Senate, or the White House changed control. And I argued at that time that the electorate was probably again poised to vote for change, hangover from the pandemic, the huge inflation surge, sort of promises of a return to normalcy that didn't really materialize. I think there were a whole confluence of things that were priming voters to vote for change, and boy, did they deliver. For the 11th time in 13 elections held since 2000, voters chose to flip the White House and the Senate, and they came very close to flipping control of the House of Representatives. But when it was all said and done, President-elect and former president, but President-elect Trump reclaimed the 6 battleground states that he lost in 2020 and to win a 312 to 226 electoral vote victory. He also was the first Republican since 2004 to win the popular vote, and those coattails extended into the United States Senate, where Republicans picked up 4 seats in Montana, Ohio, West Virginia, and Pennsylvania, and now will enter next year with a 47-seat majority, which is a nice 3-seat cushion, which will help things move along in the Senate, particularly when it comes to President Trump's nominations and some other policies, particularly around taxes, which is a topic I'm going to cover, I know is of great concern to investors. And then finally, over in the House, Republicans actually lost 2 seats in the House, and I will say in air quotes, enjoy, because it won't be easy, but we'll have a 220 to 215 seat majority. Now, when everybody is present and voting in the House, it takes 218 people to pass legislation. So 220, 215 effectively gives Republicans a 2-seat majority or a 2-vote majority in the House. Now, I can't overstate this point more, and that is that the thin majority in the House is going to really complicate policymaking. And for the first 4 or 4.5 months, it's going to be even more difficult than 220, 215. President Trump tapped 3 House members to serve in his administration. And so heading into January, really January 3rd, January 4th, Republicans in the House are going to be down to 217 seats versus 215 for Democrats. Now, 216 tied, legislation doesn't pass. So that means a delayed flight, a bad case of the sniffles, anything that can complicate, and one vote will spell defeat for any sort of legislation of consequence, and that may be partisan in nature. And so this thin majority in the House is absolutely going to be a storyline that I think people need to watch and pay attention to, particularly early on in 25, but I think it'll be an issue throughout the next 2 years in the next Congress. Now, we talked about what happened. I want to talk a moment about why it happened. And I think Jim Carville had it right back in 1992 when he said it was the economy, stupid. That's because it's generally always about the economy when it comes to particularly presidential elections. In the 11 presidential elections we've had since 1980, 8 of them have been about the economy. And in every single election, whatever voters say the most important issue is, whichever party they believe can deal with that issue best, wins. That's been the case again in the 11 elections since 1980. And this time around, the economy, I think, was the most important issue on voters' mind. In fact, among the 2/3 of voters who said the economy is not so good or the economy is poor, Donald Trump won 7 in 10 of those voters. That's the election right there. And there's a lot of noise out there about, could it have been this or could it have been that? I don't think talking heads and pundits and politicians should overthink this too much. The economy was the key issue, and I think the economy will be the dominant issue as we head into policymaking in 2025, or at least the frame through which most of these policy decisions are going to be managed and dictated. So what do those policy outcomes look or decisions look like in 2025? First and foremost, I want to underscore the fact that there's been much made about things are going to happen relatively quickly. And I think relative is the operative term here. Quick is certainly going to be the case. Unified Republican control or unified any party control allows things to move more quickly. But I would caution that things are still going to take some time, and principally because there are a number of things that have to happen before we can get to the business of cutting regulation, dealing with tariffs and trade, dealing with tax policy. And those things on the left side of the screen here, number one, cabinet nominees have to be nominated, appointed, go through the vetting process, go through committee hearings and votes, and ultimately seek floor votes on the House floor. There are 15 cabinet nominees. In the first version of the Trump administration, his last nominee was confirmed by the Senate on April 27th. So some 4 months, almost 5 months into his term, did he finally get the full cabinet confirmed. I don't think it will take that long this go around, but it will take some time. More importantly, in addition to the 15 cabinet level nominees, there are over 1,300 Senate confirmed positions that the president has to appoint. That will take committee time, that will take senator time, that will take floor time, that could be spent on other sorts of things, but those nominations and that confirmation process has to happen. And so there's going to be a lot of headspace taken up dealing with confirmations. The second thing that has to happen is the debt limit. The debt limit, according to the deal that President Biden and then Speaker Kevin McCarthy cut way back in June of 23, said that the debt limit expires on January 1st. So in about, about 20 days. The Treasury Secretary will be able to deploy extraordinary measures and extend that expiration and a default probably until May or June. But debt limit exercises are always complicated. They're very political. They will take a lot of bandwidth. And this is a discussion that's going to be had in the first and second quarter of 2025 that will, again, occupy time and headspace for politicians on both sides of the aisle, on both sides of Capitol Hill, and on the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue in the White House. Finally, Congress has failed to deal with the FY25 funding. We are in FY25, have been since October 1st of this year. They've kicked the can through this thing called a continuing resolution, or CR, in DC parlance. That CR has funded government operations since October 1st at current year levels and is set to expire next Friday, December 20th. So Congress at some point next week is going to set a new date for a new CR, probably sometime until March. We may know later today what that date is, but at some time in late March, there will be another decision on government funding that will have to happen. Again, that takes a lot of time, a lot of energy, and a lot of political capital that will occupy, again, headspace for politicians as we head into 2025 and maybe delay action on some of these other priorities that we'll take a look at on the right side. First and foremost, regulation. I think we're going to enter an environment with single party control where we see reduced regulation coming out of the agencies, some rollback of existing regulations, and these will take three forms. Number one, there's a process in Congress called the Congressional Review Act, or CRA. The Congressional Review Act says that Congress can effectively veto an agency regulation within 60 days of its issuance. Now, the CRA has a look back provision so that if there's a change in administration, it allows Congress, a new Congress, so the one that gets sworn in on January 3rd, to look back into the previous Congress and previous administration 60 legislative days. Legislative is the important word here. The legislative days aren't the same as calendar days. It's the days that Congress was in session, and they were out a lot in August and they were out a lot in October. And since they haven't adjourned the sine die, I don't know the exact date, but I'm estimating around August 1st, any regulation finalized since then will be subject to the CRA. And a simple up and down, simple majority vote, not subject to the filibuster 60 vote threshold in the Senate, Congress can repeal Biden-era regulations that were passed and finalized on or around August 1st. They'll be able to exert this power for 60 legislative days into the new year. So probably on or around June 1st, they'll be able to do this. And I expect a lot of activity from the House and the Senate in terms of repealing late hour, 11th hour Biden regulations. The second mechanism we'll see is that there are a lot of rules currently in litigation. Some of those affecting the financial services industry and investors. There's a rule at the SEC that requires disclosure from public companies of their ESG footprint. There's a rule at the Department of Labor dealing with fiduciary rules for financial advisors. There's a number of rules that are being actively litigated, and the new administration can simply come in and say, we're done litigating these cases, and the rules will effectively die on the vine and go away. I expect that to happen to most, if not all, of the rules that are in active litigation right now. The third mechanism will be through the notice and comment period. It will take time. There's a process, but through the APA, I expect there to be an issuance of new rules, either overturning old rules or making tweaks to them that we will see this sort of general deregulatory posture coming out of the new administration. The second big policy piece, and this was probably the most litigated piece on the campaign, deals with trade and tariff policy. And I've been asked probably the most about trade and tariffs from any topic since the election. And what I've been telling folks, particularly investors, is I think you have to take Trump seriously, but not literally when it comes to, when it comes to trade and tariffs. There's some authorities that he doesn't have. In fact, I don't think he can do carte blanche, the 60% tariff across the board on China. I don't think that he can do even the 10 or 20% tariff rate to all other countries. What I'm envisioning is a policy much like he pursued in the first administration, where he looks at sectors and certain industries and particular countries and uses authorities that he does have through Section 232 and 301 of the Trade Act to do targeted tariffs in certain industries. I think there are four goals that the Trump administration will have in mind when they're thinking about tariff policy. Number one is, how do we reindustrialize U.S. manufacturing? And so using tariffs toward that goal, which, by the way, includes a bias toward and preference for foreign direct investment into the United States. So if you're a foreign company, build it here, and there will be sort of a carrot and stick approach to that. I think the second goal is just to generally rebalance trade. Talking to sort of folks that are going back into the administration to deal with trade policy, they point out, hey, the most favored nation status average tariff rate for the United States is around 3.3% today. For India, it's 18.5%. And they believe, and they're right, they believe that's out of whack, and they want to try to bring that in balance. So I think you can see tariff policy leaning into how do we balance that out. And I would actually look for the Trump administration to potentially pursue free trade agreements on one-off basis with select countries. The UK comes to mind. I think India comes to mind. And those are things that I envision maybe happening as 2025 wears on. The third goal here is ultimately, how do we use tariffs and trade as negotiation tools to pursue other foreign policy objectives? We all got a really good case study in this about 10, 12 days ago when Trump tweeted out 25% tariff rates on Mexico and Canada unless they get the border under control. Everybody saw that Mexican President Gloria Sheinbaum, within 24 hours, picked up the phone and said, hey, we're working on this. What can we do? And within 72 hours, the Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, is on a plane to Mar-a-Lago trying to negotiate a deal. So look for tariffs and trade to be used as a negotiating tool for other foreign policy objectives. And finally, tariffs may be used as a source for revenue to deal with offsets to deeper tax cuts that the administration or the incoming administration and congressional Republicans want to pursue, which leads us to the third big policy priority that I see unfolding in 2025, and that's the expiration of the TCJA, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, passed by President Trump in his first term. All of those tax cuts on individual rates, corporate, pass-through businesses, so on and so forth, they're set to expire on December 31st, 2025. Now, Congress has roughly a year to deal with this expiration where there's going to be a tax increase on most individuals in this country. They're going to do this through a process called budget reconciliation, and you're going to hear a lot about that. The shorthand for budget reconciliation is it averts the Senate filibuster. In other words, you can pass a bill with 51 votes instead of 60 votes. And it means that Republicans can have a purely partisan exercise and pass a bill without any Democrat help. And I expect that's what will happen with tax policy. Now, there's some trade-offs to this fast-track procedure in the House. One trade-off is that any budget reconciliation bill has to have a direct effect on mandatory spending or revenue. Number two, and importantly, and then frankly, the reason the tax cuts are expiring in the first place is that the provisions can't have a negative revenue effect outside the 10-year budget window. And so there will be a need for offsets, particularly if Congress decides that they want to pursue permanent tax cuts. There will be a need for offsets in this space. The other obstacle is the fact that reconciliation takes multiple steps. You have to pass budget resolutions in the House and Senate. They have to be identical. Then you have to put together a bill that deals with all the instructions in the budget resolutions that every committee passes, and then you roll that up into a single omnibus bill that passes the reconciliation package. All of this is subject to multiple germane, but as many as you want, unlimited votes that can be politically really painful. And so there's a process here that's going to take some time. It's a process that's going to be very political. But there's an interesting option in order to have two reconciliation bills. Because Congress didn't pass a budget for FY25, they can do a reconciliation bill for 25, and we're heading into 26 at the end of September. They can pass a reconciliation bill for FY26. So there's two bites of the apple here. And you're already beginning to see tension between the House and the Senate on strategy with respect to moving one or two reconciliation bills that are sort of an omen of things to come, potentially with some challenges that we're going to see in tax legislation. The biggest challenge is going to be the cost. To simply extend current law, costs around, or the Congressional Budget Office will score it as a $4.6 trillion cost. There are some beginning to kick around this idea of maybe we can make that go away if we change the baseline through which you judge the tax debate. So right now, the baseline is current law, and current law says the tax cuts expire at the end of 2025. There are many saying, hey, why don't we just change the baseline to current policy, which assumes the tax cuts are already in effect. And if you do that, the $4.6 trillion goes away. There will be budget hawks in the Republican Party that squawk at this, but this is under active consideration. And if that's done, it will free up headspace to do some of the other tax cuts that were talked about on the campaign trail. At the end of the day, I think there's going to be a need for offsets. There's going to be a demand from blue state, New York, California, Pennsylvania, New Jersey Republicans to repeal the state and local income tax deduction, which hits high tax states really hard. And some of these offsets may be around tariff and trade policy. This is where the two will ultimately intersect. And the votes on that could be tough. There's not universal support for tariffs and trade among Republicans, particularly in the House. And so if tariffs and trade are used as an offset, that could create a vote counting problem. Again, we go full circle to the fact that you have a very thin majority in the House and frankly, a relatively thin majority in the Senate. And there's going to be a lot of negotiation, a lot of math. And in the long run, it's going to take a lot of time to move this forward. At the end of the day, there will be a tax bill. It probably looks more or less like current law with some nips and tucks, but this is going to be an active debate that goes, I think my prediction is well into the summer, if not the fall. I'm going to leave it with a couple final thoughts for investors, and that is around markets and the fact that they really don't care who the president of the United States is. Since Eisenhower, every president but two, Nixon and George W. Bush, who had the unfortunate circumstance, Nixon had deep recession in 73 and 74, W. Bush, the financial crisis in 07, 08, at the end of both of their terms that dinged their numbers. Otherwise, they would have been positive. But at the end of the day, markets really don't care because we all sort of know they had Northwest or Northeast. My final slide, if you're a Democrat and are upset about the election and decide that you want to pull your money out until a Democrat's in charge, not a good idea. And vice versa, if you were a Republican and pulled your money out when Joe Biden was elected, not a good idea. $1,000 invested back in 1953, if you invested only in Democrat presidents, if you were a Democrat, or only in Republican presidents, if you were a Republican, didn't do very well. You can't even see the line. It's blurred purple because the red and blue are blurred out there. If you stay in the market, stay in the game, and invest through administrations and political cycles, your dollar's going to go a lot further. And I think, Andrew, I'll leave it there and we can go to Q&A.
Jason, that was terrific. Appreciate that. At the bottom of your screen, there is a button that says Q&A. If you click on that, you can ask questions that we'll take a look at and get to Jason, assuming we have time. We have a number that have already come through, one of which you addressed with the question about the Trump tax cuts and the likelihood that they get extended. A follow-on that I wanted to ask you about that, and you kind of mentioned it, but are there any fiscal hawks left in Washington? Does anybody care the fact that we're, the deficits that we're running now are so large relative to anything anybody could have imagined, even 5 to 10 years ago? And is that only going to become an issue when it becomes an issue and there's a failed auction or interest expense, which is already going to be $1 trillion, gets to be $2 trillion?
Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. We're approaching, if not already exceeded, $36 trillion in debt. That's over 100% of GDP. That's a point at which economists begin to get worried about things. One. Two, in the fiscal year that ended on September 30th, we ran about a $1.7 trillion deficit, which was 6.6% of GDP. By the way, the economy was doing well. We weren't in any sort of crisis. Imagine if we were in a financial crisis and support payments had to start flowing. I mean, that would just hockey stick increase. And so 6.6% of GDP of deficit spending in relatively good times is not a good outcome. You add to that the fact that today, and you alluded to this, in that deficit figure in the overall budget picture, we're not quite there yet, Andrew. We'll probably be there next year, but we're approaching $1 trillion in debt service. And in a rate environment that's higher for longer, we're going to easily hit that again, probably next year. That makes interest on the national debt the third largest program on the federal budget, behind Social Security, Medicare debt, ahead of national defense, ahead of all other discretionary spending combined. And you don't get a plane, you don't support a veteran, you don't do anything. It's just money out the door, and it's a huge problem. I think when you cross the $1 trillion Rubicon, that begins to sober the mind of politicians, and they begin to worry. One. Two, I think the bond market, you alluded to this, may ultimately be the arbiter of some of this policy. There are some deficit hawks left, and there is concern there, but there are a small number. but in thin majorities, they may be able to have outsized influence on moving policy. And deficit talks, by the way, exist in both parties. But I fear that it may require maybe not a failed auction, but it may require the 10-year really spiking, and other things happening to really focus the attention. And then I fear the default will be, well, let's set up a commission and study it and come up with recommendation. I mean, by the way, you kind of have that in this Doge.
That's a great lead into
Right, that Musk and Ramaswamy are going to be running. It's a poor name. It's kind of funny, right? Because it's named after a joke coin, but the D in Doge, department, is a misnomer. A department takes an act of Congress. At best, this is a presidential commission, whose authority will be to make recommendations, right? And so people who believe that the Doge is actually going to be able to affect cuts, that's wrong-sided. They'll be able to make recommendations. They'll send them to Congress, who can say yay or nay. Congress often says nay. And there's a whole bunch of reasons for that we can get into.
So you mentioned Department of Defense. You mentioned departments that require congressional oversight. Curious what your thoughts are on the nominees that appear to be a little bit at danger, with Gabbard and the Department of Defense leading the two, and RFK.
Yeah. Look, I generally hold the view, I don't, regardless of who the president is, that you won an election and you generally should be entitled to your cabinet. That's my personal point of view. And unless there's some real issue with a nominee, but I also hold the view that the United States Senate, I am a creature of the Congress. I was a House guy, not a Senate guy. I call that the House of Lords up there. But the United States Senate has a role, a constitutional role, in the advice and consent process, and they're going through that process right now. You saw one nominee withdraw because there were concerns among senators that he probably didn't have the votes, Matt Gaetz for AG. That process is underway for Pete Hegseth, the Department of Defense, as you alluded to. I'm not sure where that's going to land. It seems like he is heading in the right direction. If we would have had this last week, I would have said he probably doesn't make it to the end of the week. But things seem to have turned around a little bit for him, for a whole bunch of reasons. Gabbard seems to be flying under the radar right now, and actually, I think Kennedy's an interesting one. Kennedy, it wouldn't surprise me if Kennedy gets some Democratic votes, but loses some Republican votes. There's just a interesting unorthodox nature to that nomination in that role, where on the one hand, there's sort of an anti-big ag, anti-pharma posture that he's taken publicly in the past, but he's also very pro-choice, which is going to turn off some Republicans. And so that one's going to be an interesting one. I don't have a dog in that fight, so I don't, I'm happy with where we are on the economic side. Bessent's going to be great. I'm really thrilled with Paul Atkins at the SEC. He's a former commissioner. I've known him for years, worked with him, and that's going to be great. So I don't have a dog in the HHS fight other than to sort of eat some popcorn and enjoy how that one unfolds, because it's going to be an interesting one. Because I think you'll probably see some interesting juxtaposition of votes on that one.
So now I want to shift gears just a little bit in terms of the focus. And as you said, if we would have had this conversation last week, I don't know if this would have been as timely, but given what happened over the weekend in Syria and what's happening in the Middle East, and having Rubio being the Secretary of State likely, could you just give an overview of what you think the incoming administration's perspective is going to be on the Middle East? And if you have any insight in terms of what Washington's sentiment is in general about, what appears to be a very chaotic situation.
Yeah, so I will begin my comments with saying these are not waters in which I normally swim. I do financial services policy, but some opinion. So number one, what I do know is the Biden administration is aggressively, and they have been, but they're really ratcheting it up. Jake Sullivan got on a plane yesterday or today to Israel to try to get a ceasefire deal with Israel-Hamas before the incoming administration. I don't know whether that's to help or hurt. I don't have an opinion on that, but I do know that that's actively under negotiation and in play right now. The Syria one's interesting. I was surprised at the speed with which the rebels moved through the country, through Aleppo, and then ultimately into Damascus to take Damascus like that. And that said to me, remember, Syria is a quasi-Iranian and Russian proxy in the Middle East. And that says to me that whether through Ukraine or whether through sort of the campaign that Israel's waged on Iran over the last year and a half, have maybe potentially depleted their ability to defend a quasi-ally in the region, which was, I think, an interesting thing to think about, and how that positions Syria in the region as a power player or not, and what dynamics will ensue there. It's an extraordinarily complicated region. It's not even three-dimensional chess; it's four-dimensional. But I do think potentially some good news is that the Iranians' capacity to exert influence through proxies like Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, and certainly through nation states like Syria, I think is severely diminished. And that might actually be a good thing. Actually, not might, it is a good thing, and something that on which we can seize.
Okay. We'll get you back to the areas you feel more comfortable. Trade. Let's talk a little bit about trade and tariffs and Trump's position. He had the interview this weekend where he was pretty explicit about his enthusiasm for tariffs. The incoming Treasury Secretary, who has, I think, at times expressed some support, but has said he wants to use them more as a negotiating tool
And revenue. And revenue.
and revenue tool. Could you talk a little bit about how the mechanism that the administration thinks tariffs can help? Because I think in one of your slides you showed that tariffs were an offset in terms of a revenue generator to pay for some other things they wanted to do. But at the end of the day, they've also said what we really want is people just to make stuff here, which would get rid of the tariffs.
Yeah. I mean, as I indicate, goal number one is reindustrialization. And the administration, whether it's the incoming president or his people that are dealing in trade policy, have made that abundantly clear. And I think, as I hinted to, if that means you're a foreign company and you bring production here, by the way, including PRC, bring it on. I think President Trump would be very comfortable with that notion on the PRC side, maybe within some limits, depending on the type of business that we're talking about. But the goal is reindustrialization and make stuff in the United States. The slide, yeah, $2.7 trillion is the estimate that it's sort of a hybrid estimate from a bunch of third-party analysts, but it sort of lands in the midpoint is what I did there. About $2.7 trillion, assuming a 10 to 20% across the board tariff. By the way, I don't think that's going to happen. That would take an act of Congress. The president can't do, I don't believe the president can do uniform tariffs unilaterally. Article 2 of the Constitution gives Congress the sole tariff authority. Now, they've ceded a lot of that through legislation over the years to the executive branch, but I think an across-the-board tariff would be crossing a line where they haven't ceded that authority. So I think what you're going to see out of the administration is reinvigorating Section 301 investigations that emerge out of the Department of Commerce, reinvigorating Section 232 investigations out of the USTR, United States Trade Representative, that looks at activities, businesses, and sectors and countries and exerting tariffs there. That's what happened first go around with China. It was 76 pages of listings of companies, and there's a process involved in that. It just doesn't, you don't waive, right? There's notice and comment. You see the list. You can go in and lobby for exceptions. Many businesses did. The Koreans did big time when it came to steel, for example, and they negotiated a quota rate. There's going to be a lot. I personally think there's going to be a lot of negotiation here, and this is something that will be borne out over months, not days.
This morning they had the latest CPI inflation data came out, and it shows that we appear to be kind of stuck at a level of just under 3% annual inflation. That's what the last 90 days would suggest to us. Tariffs, it's debatable or not debatable. Some people would say it is. Some people would say not as much. But I think there's an argument to be made that the tariffs are inflationary, and reducing the labor supply, which would be the mass deportations, would also potentially be inflationary. Do you hear, and I'm curious if you hear from, I would say, kind of your rank and file politician who has another election coming up in 2 years from the House, or senators coming up. President Trump this is it. He doesn't have to worry about reelection. So if inflation is still at a level that is consistent with what we're seeing in current data, are you going to start hearing some things from rank and file politicians saying we got to get more aggressive on that?
Short answer is yes. So this goes back to my slide. It's the economy stupid. And my observation that all of this policy is going to be filtered through that lens. And I've talked to people heading into the administration, particularly to deal with trade policy, and they are 100% absolutely listening to the inflation argument, which is again why I think you'll see the tariff and trade policy differ from the campaign probably 60% across the. I just don't see that happening because there is like you, Andrew, I believe tariffs are probably inflationary. And if they start seeing that happen, I think you'll see a dialing back and a calibrating of policy there. Same thing on immigration. Same thing potentially on even the tax cuts, which where I hinted at this. I think the 10 years is going to be the arbiter of policy here, and something that I'm going to be paying kind of attention to.
We had a question in the queue that just said, what is Sixth Meridian doing to address the long-term impacts from ballooning U.S. deficits? And that's a tricky question because a U.S. deficit can be very beneficial for corporate America because government spending gets spent and that goes onto the balance sheets of companies. So it's not necessarily that you need to be concerned with the stock market. It's more on the 10-year and out on the treasury market where you could see that show up. So that would be kind of it's a quick and crude answer to that question. But remember, every dollar that gets spent by the government is somebody else's revenue. And so it could be.
And it also sounds like we agree that the 10-year may be the final arbiter of policy.
That could be the final arbiter. Exactly.
Yeah.
There would be a lot of companies who would tell you they're very comfortable with these levels of deficits because it's very impactful for their income statements.
Okay.
Okay, we have another question that came in. Okay, so this is this was going to put your crystal ball on. So thinking out, since this is Trump's last go, who are the standard bearers for both parties going forward, for the Republicans and for the Democrats?
Wow. Wow, that's a great question. Look, the Democrats, we'll start with the Democrats because they're the out party now, for sure. And I think have a lot of soul searching that they've got to go through to figure out, what they're going to do 26 and 28. In 26, history alone, and the fact that it's a 2-seat margin in the House, I think the early money would be on the Democrats flipping the House in 26. And if you're a Democrat and care about the longer term future, you might want to worry about that because you'll flip the House and say, "Oh, look, we did it right," and maybe not affix some of I think, my personal view, the many structural problems that exist within the party, and so that'll be interesting to see how that plays out. The ultimate arbiter may be what what 28 looks like. There's a long list of governors for the Democrats that are angling already. 1,148 days until the next presidential election for the right to be in the White House. I mean, and everybody knows this list. It's Gavin Newsom out of California. I think he's got a heavy road to haul. Gretchen Whitmer out of Michigan. It'll be interesting, and I mean this in just the most flatline way possible, but it'd be interesting to see if the Democratic Party says we want to take a third shot at a female candidate at the top of the ticket. You've got Josh Shapiro. I'm sitting in our home office in Philadelphia, so the governor here, will make a run at it. I'm not sure any of those are the right choices for them. The Democratic Party may need to look back to, sort of the early 90s when they were really trying to figure out where they were going to go, and look to somebody like a Andy Beshear in Kentucky, who's more moderate and has learned how to win in red states and build coalitions that are unique. Roy Cooper, former governor, outgoing governor of North Carolina, is another one to come on. There's a long list, though. And by the way, there's people that aren't on that list that will emerge in the next 4 years for whatever reason, whether they rose to the occasion in a crisis or whatever the case may be. But there's a lot of work and the Democratic Party has to figure out, which direction are we going to go? They're at a fork in the road being more to the left or tacking back to the center. And I'm not sure which way they'll go. I know which way I would advise them to go, but who knows which way they'll choose. When you look at 28 or 26 for Democrat, one final point on Democrats and the Senate, 3-seat margin. It's interesting when you look at the Senate map for 26, Republicans have the problem that the Democrats had this time around. They're defending 2-to-1 seats. So Democrats defended 23 seats this time, Republicans just 11. The flip side is true in 2026. If you're a Republican, though, the good news is you're defending seats in Tennessee and Alabama and your home turf. Democrats were defending in battleground states, Arizona, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. It was a hard road for them. And so if you look at the map and you're a Democrat into 26 on the Senate side, there are no obvious pickup opportunities. Maine, maybe. Susan Collins will be on the ballot. She's a tough out. She's done a really good job in a blue state of cutting her own path and her brand. And North Carolina, maybe. But you're also defending in Michigan, and you're defending in some other states that are tough for you. So I don't see Democrats making any headway in the Senate. I think the early money again is probably just history alone that the House flips because of a 2-seat margin. Republicans. Wow, that's an interesting question. I mean, the natural heir apparent, of course, is the vice president, right? And that J.D. Vance, inherits the wand. There was a poll, first one I've seen this morning, in an outfit called Morning Consult, and tied at like 24-25%. I can't remember the exact number. J.D. Vance, okay, Donald Trump Jr. And then it dropped off to, Ron DeSantis and Nikki Haley and a whole bunch of other people that maybe a couple I haven't even heard of. But what was interesting was that there's this perception, at least, that maybe Don Trump Jr. is the heir apparent, and there's a dynasty that moves on here. The question was funny because it talked about Clinton and Trump moving on, and there was another observation that 28, if there is no Trump on the ballot, will be the first time since like 1980 that there wasn't a Bush, a Clinton, a Biden, or an Obama on a ballot, either as vice president or president, since 1980. And so hopefully, with the questioner, I'm hopeful that we can move beyond some of this as well and find some new blood. But we'll see. But 20 is going to be interesting. And again, 1,148 days if you're counting.
We appreciate that. Okay, well, we've gone through the questions that I had and the questions that the audience had. Jason, we really appreciate your time and your insight. I thought that was a very quick 45 minutes and very insightful. So appreciate you and your time.
Happy to do it. Always fun to be with my friends from Kansas. I get to go home in about next Friday. I'm heading to Manhattan to see my mom. So look forward to seeing the homeland.